In this video, I'm going to show you step by step how I edited this photograph in Lightroom. I've chosen this photograph because of the unusual lighting that's present in this scene. If you look at this photograph to begin with before we've done any editing, it might appear to be underexposed. The house and the truck are way too dark. The foreground is quite dark for something that was shot in the afternoon. Now the reason for that is if we look at the sky up here, the sky is a lot lighter than the rest of the scene. Now if I had set the exposure just based on proper exposure for the house and the truck and the foreground, then the sky would have been badly overexposed. And here's an example. This is another photograph that I made of the same scene. This was made using an incident light meter held at the position of the subject right in front of the truck. And normally an incident light meter will give you the correct exposure for digital images like this, but this one was unusual because the sky was so much brighter than the rest of the scene, and an incident light meter can't take into account stuff that's in the background that's real light. This scene was also somewhat backlit, even though it was an overcast day. The main lighting was still somewhat coming from behind the house, and that's something else that an incident light meter would fail at giving the proper exposure for. So what I did with this scene, I wanted to make sure that I exposed it so that there would be full detail in the sky, but I didn't want the foreground stuff, the truck and the house and the ground, to be so badly underexposed that I couldn't recover it later. And so what I did was I used a technique that I use quite a lot when I'm photographing scenes that have a really broad brightness range like this. I took an incident light reading first, standing at the subject position with the dome pointing back toward the camera. And then I walked back to the camera position and I took a reflected light meter reading of the scene and I averaged those two readings. And that's what we got here. Now, if you look here, the sky has good separation and detail in it. The foreground stuff is a little bit dark, but it's not completely lost. There's still detail in here. And if we look at the histogram here, we can see that there's nothing in the blacks that's really truly blocked up, and there's nothing in the whites that are either. We've captured the full brightness range in the picture, but at the default settings in Lightroom, this has made much of the picture look too dark. Now there's several different ways that we can bring this detail back into the darker areas here, and one way would be to change the exposure using the exposure slider. And as we lighten that up, we can see that the house and the truck are lightening up quite a bit, but we're starting to lose some of the separation in the sky. Now, once we've done that, we could always pull the highlights down using the highlight slider and bring that separation back. Now, we're still a little bit too dark in this area here, so we can use the shadow slider then to lighten that part back up. Now the problem is that even though this stuff is now light enough, it's kind of flat looking. It needs contrast. We don't want to increase the overall contrast of the image because that's going to push the lights up here too light again. So what we can do is we can take the black slider and pull this down a little bit. That'll increase contrast a little. And that looks okay, but I still feel like the image overall is a little bit too flat. Something else that we can do is we can use the clarity slider and push that upwards, and that increases contrast then in the midtones without really affecting the lights and the darks. Maybe go a little bit higher on the shadow slider. Yeah, now this is looking pretty good now. Now I'm going to go ahead here and create a virtual copy of this. A virtual copy in Lightroom is something that lets you do multiple versions of the same image. remember that all the editing you do in Lightroom is non-destructive. It doesn't actually affect the original file. And so by creating virtual copies, we can have multiple copies we can look at and compare the two against each other when we've tried different settings. And to create a virtual copy, what you do is you right-click the thumbnail for the picture, and then you'll see Create Virtual Copy. Click that, and it creates it. And the virtual copy is going to have the exact same settings that the original had. And what I'm going to do here is I want to reset the settings back to default so that we can work on this and try it with a different set of settings. If you want to reset all your settings back to default, select the thumbnail for the one you want to do this to, right click it, go to Develop Settings, and choose Reset. And there, now we're back to the default settings again. Now here's another way that we can do this. We can take just the shadow slider and not use the exposure slider, and just raise the shadows up quite a bit. That may be going a little too far. Let's see. Now this has got better detail, I think, in the sky. Well, it's not quite as light as the previous version. So if we want to keep the sky a little darker to keep all that separation between the clouds and the sky, I think this works better. Now, of course, the midtones and the darker tones are very flat, just like in the first example. And I'm going to pull the black slider down a bit to compensate for that. Now, what happens when you use the black slider? The difference between the shadow slider and the black slider is the shadow slider tries to raise up the shadow tones without affecting the maximum black. So if you have something that's truly black, truly 100% maximum black, raising the shadow slider won't affect that tone. It'll only affect things that are like the real dark gray tones. The black slider actually affects the maximum black tone. So we can, by pulling the black slider down, we're pulling things that might have been dark gray down to pure black. It's kind of like in Photoshop moving in the ends of the histogram in the levels slider. This does the same thing. And so if we magnify this up so we can see the actual dark tones, we can see what's really happening here. At 0, we can see the dark tones are kind of flat and there's a lot of noise in there, which we'll get rid of when we get to the noise reduction phase. If we pull this down a little bit, it's not really super important to have full detail in this area here. It's not an important part of the picture, but we've brought some more contrast back to the house and the other midtone areas. Now the house is still, I think, too dark. And so what we can do now is we use the tone curve. Now the default in Lightroom for the curve is to have these 4 sliders here. And by using these sliders, you don't have full control over the curve. You can't just arbitrarily grab it anywhere and move it up and down without it fighting you and not wanting to, without I don't know how to explain this. It wants to manipulate these sliders even if you try to grab the curve, and so I'm having trouble here lightening just the midtones. It's affecting the highlights more by doing this. So what we're going to do is, in order to restore the tone curve to a fully manual control like you would see in Photoshop, and I have a tutorial online on how to use Photoshop's curves. This will work the same way once we do this, and you click this little box right here, and that gets rid of those sliders, and now you can move the curve anywhere you want without any problems. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the middle of the curve, which represents the midtones, because the midtones are what we want to lighten here. We don't want to affect the real light areas that much. We don't really want to affect the dark areas that much. We're more interested in the midtones. So we grab it in the middle, because the middle of the curve represents the midtones. The top area of the curve represents the highlight tones, and the dark tones are represented by the bottom of the curve. If we grab the middle of the curve and raise it up, we see that the midtones are lightening, but it's lightening the highlights and shadows a bit too, but not as much as it lightens the highlight, or not as much as it lightens the midtones. Now, by getting this up where I want it for the house, we've started to lose a bit of our separation up here. So if we go back up to the highlight slider, we pull that down a bit, we can restore our tone separation in here. And that's darkened down the midtones just slightly too. We'll lighten them up a little bit more. Now let's compare this rendering with the first one we did. I made this one a little bit lighter than the original. Let's lighten this one up a little bit too. Not quite that much. Now we can see these are actually quite similar to each other. This one is a little bit flatter because we didn't use the clarity control like we did on the first one. Let's raise that up a little bit too. We can see there's not really a huge difference between the two of them, and we've used two totally different approaches to the settings and gotten the same results, and that's something you'll find in Lightroom. There's often more than one way to get the same results with a photograph, so sometimes there's not, a quote-unquote right way to do it. There may be multiple right ways to do it. There's so many different options you have for control in Lightroom. You got the exposure slider and the contrast, to the highlights and shadows and the whites and blacks and clarity and such. So by using different combinations of these, you can get the same results. And a lot of it just depends really on, you need to practice with it and get to know what the different settings do and try different things. Create virtual copies of images you're working on. Try them with multiple different settings and see what you like better. See what works best for you. The great thing about Lightroom is you can create an unlimited number of these virtual copies and try different things without affecting your original file. Now that we've got the basic tone setting done, then we need to look at some of the other stuff in Lightroom. Now, the white balance I'm not going to mess with. I set the white balance in camera by setting the white balance setting manually on my camera. And I got the numbers for that from a handheld color temperature meter that I use, a Sekonic C700. And so the way that works is you take it basically works like an incident light meter. You stand at the subject position, point its sensor back toward the camera, take a reading, and it tells you what color temperature setting to put into your camera. And so that's what I did with this. And so the white balance is as shot because it's going to use the same settings that were on the camera. And I think the white balance looks good the way it is, so I'm not going to change that. If we go down here further, then we have sharpening. Now, it took me a lot of practice to come up with the sharpening settings that I typically use. And these are the settings I typically use with my camera, which is a Canon 5D Mark II, when I'm shooting at ISO 400, which is what I did with this one, because this was shot handheld at ISO 400. I would use different settings if I were shooting at 100, or if I was shooting at a higher setting like 800 or 1600 or 3200. And the reason is because the higher ISO settings can tolerate less sharpening without the noise being really emphasized. And even at 400, if we zoom in here, we can see there's quite a lot of noise here in these shadows because we lighten them so much. Now, there's two different ways that we can deal with that. One is by increasing the noise reduction really high. And you can see the noise is going away as we do this. And that actually looks pretty good, but it also somewhat reduces detail resolution. You can see here in the grow, we're losing our fine details. the ground is starting to look kind of blurred, almost like almost painterly like, because it doesn't have the real fine detail in the dirt. And so instead of using the real high noise reduction setting, something else that you can do is the masking setting. And if we look at this picture, the noise is a lot worse in flat toned areas that don't have detail in them, like the bumper here, or the front of the truck that's just flat white, or the siding here where the slats are just plain, the green color without much detail in them. And what we would like to do is we'd like to get rid of the noise in those flat areas without affecting the detail in the areas that have fine detail in them, like around the headlights here or in the grill. And the masking setting lets you do that. What masking does is it tells the sharpening, it tells Lightroom to not sharpen flat-toned areas. And the higher you set the masking, the greater the size of the areas are that are not affected by sharpening. And so if we raise this up, we can see the noise starting to go away in the flat areas, but it's not affecting resolution as much in the detailed areas. And I found a setting of about 45 works really well for masking for the shots I shoot at ISO 400 with my Canon 5D Mark II. Now, you may find you're going to get different settings that you're going to want to use if you have a different camera. And this is something that is just going to have to come from trial and error. Try different settings and see what works for you. I found with my camera the sharpening setting, the amount setting of 50 and radius of 0.7 works real well for most shots I do, either at 100 or 400. The detail setting I set usually between 30 and 40, depending on the speed. Usually I set it at 30 or 35 for ISO 400 shots and 40 or 45 for ISO 100 shots. The ISO 100 shots I usually don't use any masking for because this camera really doesn't have any noise at ISO 100. At 400 though, we saw it does have noise in the flat areas, so we've set this masking setting at 45. Now we still have some noise, and I do set a little bit of noise reduction when I shoot at ISO 400. And typically I set the noise reduction at around 15. And we can see that most of the noise has now gone away. There's a little bit of a fine grain structure in there, and that doesn't really bother me. I came up from, my start in photography was with film when I was young. And so I'm used to grain being present to some extent. I'm not someone that has to have every bit of noise totally gone, because I think that a little bit of grain gives it some structure. But if we look here, we can see that the dirt here now has more structure to it. It's not so pasty looking, and it actually has the feeling of fine grains of dirt that the real soil has. Now the next thing we're going to want to set is lens corrections. I always click remove chromatic aberration. Most lenses today have some amount of chromatic aberration, and what that is if you look at a photograph and look at it up close, hard edge details like the edges of tree branches against the sky, or even like the edges of a roof against the sky, will sometimes have like purple or greenish fringing around them. That's chromatic aberration. Clicking this removes it for the most part. Every once in a while I see a picture where the automatic chromatic aberration removal in Lightroom doesn't remove all of it. And in that case you can go to the manual controls and use these sliders to get rid of it. But most of the time that's not necessary in my experience, at least with the lenses I use. Now the next thing that we're going to use down here is enable profile corrections. And when you click that, it's going to fill this in with the lens that you used. Well, it will with most lenses. There's some I found with third-party lenses. I have a Tokina lens that I use quite a bit, and I've also used Sigma lenses too, and they don't tend to automatically fill in. When I use those lenses, I have to manually choose the make of the lens, Tokina or whatever, and then fill in the model of the lens. Because Lightroom has profiles built in for almost all the lenses that are made today, from not just the camera manufacturers like Canon and Nikon, but also Sigma and Tamron and Tokina and such. And what these do is when you enable the profile corrections, it does two things. One is it corrects for geometric distortion. The profiles that Lightroom has built in know what the distortion characteristics of different lenses are, and if it's a zoom, it even is able to correct for the differences in distortion at different focal lengths on a zoom. Because if you've ever used a zoom lens, you know that the amount of distortion that a lens gives sometimes will vary depending on which focal length you have it set at. So this automatically corrects for that. The other thing it corrects for is vignetting, and what vignetting is most lenses, the image that they give is brighter in the center than it is at the corners. There's some light fall off toward the edges of the scene that makes the corners and edges darker than the center. The vignetting correction lightens up the edges and corners so that they match the brightness of the center so that you have even lighting over the entire picture. And Lightroom's profiles, just like with distortion, they have built-in knowledge of how much vignetting a lens gives at different focal lengths and can automatically correct for that. Now there are manual sliders here too that you can change the amount of distortion and vignetting correction if you find that the profile didn't give you exactly what you want. And there are times sometimes when I'll turn the vignetting correction down because I want the corners darker to draw the eye into the center. Now I'm not going to do that with this picture, but that's something to think about. Sometimes the correction for vignetting is something you might not necessarily want to use. Now if we go down here, then the next thing is transform. And what this is used for, this is for correcting perspective distortion. So if you photograph a building, if you want to see the top of the building, you have to point the camera upward a bit, and that tends to make the top of the building look narrower than the bottom. It's called keystoning. You can correct for that using these settings. And I have a video online of how to do perspective correction in Lightroom that explains in much greater detail how these different controls work. Because there's different ways you can do it. There's the grid line setting where you can draw lines along straight lines in your picture. Oops, didn't want to magnify that. And it will automatically correct them so that they're all straight up and down and side to side straight. Or you can use the manual sliders. Either one of them works well, and like I said, it's too much to get into in this how-to video because I'm concentrating more on how I did this photograph so that you can see how I worked with a single photograph. But I do have the video online that you can watch and see in more detail how these settings work. Now if you put your mouse over these settings here, a set of grids appears. And you can see if the picture needs any kind of correction like that, and it looks to me like it needs to be rotated very slightly to the right. And so I'm going to use the rotate setting here. Look at the grid, see how it works, and see if everything is straight. And it looks like it is. I can see the grid lines along the lines of the siding. And I think that looks really good. Now the other correction that we might want to look at is there is a little bit of keystoning in this picture. The top of the house is slightly narrower than the bottom, and the vertical correction fixes that. And you can go either way. You can actually increase the amount of keystoning, or you can decrease it. And of course we want to decrease it, so if you watch the lines. Now this house is going to be impossible to fully correct everything because it looks to me like this room here, this wall is kind of bowed outward compared to the other vertical walls on the same side of the house. And you're going to find that with a lot of old buildings. There's a lot of old buildings that just plain aren't square anymore. They've sagged with age, or the foundation has settled, or you know, the roof has started sagging. And so you have to accept that sometimes you can't fully correct the perspective in an architectural photograph if it's an old building. And this building here is old. The woman who owns this place told me that it was 160 years old. So anything that's any wood frame building that's been around that long is going to have problems, and you're not necessarily going to be able to correct the perspective perfectly with something like this. And so you try to get it as close as you can, and you accept that as the best compromise you can get. Now, when we've done these corrections, we can see this white stuff, a little bit of a white border has emerged. And that's because of the way that Lightroom manipulates the image to do the perspective correction. We need to crop this off. Now there's two ways you can do that. One is you can simply hit the constrain crop button and Lightroom will automatically cut that stuff off. Or you can do it manually. We'll unclick the button there, click the manual cropping. And one thing that Lightroom has done, because when you do constrain crop, when you use the automatic thing, it tries to maintain the aspect ratio of the rectangle. And if we wanted to, we could do it manually and see a little bit more of the sky up here. Now the rectangle is going to be a little bit of a shorter, fatter rectangle than it was originally. But I think that I would rather have that extra sky in there, so I usually do this manually. Once you got it right, just hit return or enter, and the cropping is done then. Now looking this over, I think this looks pretty good. We've maintained the separation and detail in the sky. We've brought back, you know, good tonality and detail in the house and in the truck and in the foreground here. All these rocks here in the front, this is basically going to be the bed for the foundation. They're going to pour a foundation of cement on top of this. And once that's done, then they're going to pull the house right over the top of it and drop it down on the new foundation. So yeah, there you have it. That's how I work this picture in Lightroom. And I've chosen pictures like this for my How I Do It series, showing ones that have unusual lighting conditions where you're going to have to do a lot more work in Lightroom than something that was shot under more ideal conditions. If you've got a photograph that was shot under ideal, perfect light, you know, the stuff in Lightroom is easy. You may not have to do very much tone correction. And so to give you an idea of what's possible in Lightroom and how to correct the really difficult ones, that's why I've chosen ones like this. And I think we've got a pretty good result here. If we look at it magnified, we can see we've got good tonal separation in the whites here. The white balance looks good to me too from my color temperature meter. So the only thing left to do now is to export the file. I typically export these as PSD files, the Photoshop format, to use as archived final images. And typically then I'll open it in Photoshop and do any other tweaking that needs to be done.